February 19th, 1942, 9:58 a.m. Darwin, Northern Territory. The harbour moved the way it always did in the wet season heat. Men on the wharf shifted cargo with practiced rhythm. Deck crews shouted short instructions over engines and winches. The air carried salt, diesel, and sweat. Shirts were open or gone entirely. It was Thursday, and for many of the men working the waterfront, the war still felt like something happening far away. Names on a map, headlines read days late. A few minutes earlier, the sky had looked ordinary. High light, thin cloud, the hard glare of late morning building. Then the sound arrived first, an unfamiliar rising drone that did not match any local flight. A harbour worker looked up. In some later accounts, he was named William Caldwell. What mattered was what he saw. Aircraft in formation, not one or two, but dozens, then more behind them, filling the northern sky until the sun seemed muted by wings. For a moment, there was hesitation rather than alarm. Darwin had Allied aircraft passing through. American bombers had been expected in the region. At a distance, silhouettes could be misread. Men shaded their eyes and tried to decide what they were looking at. Then the first bomb fell. It struck near the shipping in the harbour, and the blast rolled across the water like a physical U-dar. An ammunition ship, HMAS Neptuna, was caught in the opening blows. The ship carried explosives for the northern defence effort, and when fire reached them, the detonation was catastrophic. Instant, violent, final. People close to it had no time to run, no time to think. The shockwave punched outward, flattening men on the wharf and snapping windows far from the waterfront. A dense column of smoke and debris rose above the anchorage and began to spread, marking the centre of the strike for anyone in town who still did not understand. The second and third explosions came before the first had fully settled. Dive bombers screamed down in steep angles, engines howling, and pulled out low over the water. Fighters followed, sweeping across the harbour approaches. Steel fragments and splinters of timber rained down. Men who had been joking minutes earlier ran for cover, without knowing where cover could be found. Darwin's sense of distance, its belief that the continent itself was a shield, ended in those first seconds. The war had crossed oceans and taken island after island. Now it had reached the Australian mainland. It was not a warning shot. It was a deliberate, coordinated attack against ships, fuel, and the infrastructure that kept the North alive. And as smoke began to blanket the harbour, it became clear this was only the beginning. By February 1942, the war in the Pacific was no longer a distant contest of fleets and diplomacy. It was a rapid, collapsing front. In less than 3 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan had dismantled the Allied defensive system across Southeast Asia with speed that shocked even experienced military planners. Hong Kong had fallen after a short, brutal siege. Manila was under occupation. The Philippines were collapsing despite determined resistance. Most damaging of all was the surrender of Singapore, long described as Britain's strongest fortress in the East. More than 80,000 Allied troops laid down their arms there. It was the largest capitulation in British military history, and it sent a clear signal throughout the region. The old assumptions about imperial power no longer held. The Japanese advance continued south. The Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, were being seized island by island. Oil fields, airstrips, and ports were falling into Japanese hands. Each capture strengthened Japan's ability to project power deeper into the Pacific while denying the Allies the resources needed to fight back. This was not random expansion. Japanese strategy followed a clear logic. The objective was to establish a wide defensive perimeter, stretching from the central Pacific through Southeast Asia, fortified by airfields and naval bases. Within this perimeter, Japan would control vital raw materials, oil, rubber, tin, and force the United States and its allies to fight a long, costly campaign far from their own industrial centres. If the cost became too high, Japan believed, the Allies might negotiate. Australia stood just beyond that expanding arc. For decades, Australian defence planning had relied on distance. The continent was large, sparsely populated in the north, and far from Europe. The assumption was that any major threat would be detected early and stopped well to the north. But by early 1942, those buffers were gone. Japanese aircraft were operating from bases in Timor and the eastern Dutch East Indies. Japanese carrier forces had already demonstrated their reach in Hawaii and the Indian Ocean. Darwin's position made it unavoidable. It was the northernmost major port on the Australian mainland, closer to Asia than to Sydney or Melbourne. It served as a staging point for Allied aircraft and a transit hub for troops and supplies moving toward the Netherlands East Indies. American and Australian ships used its harbour to refuel, rearm, and regroup. From a Japanese perspective, Darwin was not a city, it was a military node. Neutralising it would not require invasion. A sustained air assault could cripple its port facilities, destroy aircraft on the ground, and sever the supply route between Australia and the rest of the Allied position in the southwest Pacific. There was also a psychological calculation. If the Australian mainland could be struck openly and repeatedly, public confidence might fracture. Political pressure could force Australian leaders to pull forces back from overseas theatres to defend their own shores. Even doubt would serve Japanese interests. For Allied commanders, Darwin was a liability they could not easily reinforce and could not afford to lose. For Japanese planners, it was an exposed target, lightly defended and strategically valuable. On the morning of February 19, 1942, that calculation was put into action. Leading aircraftman Charles Buster Pearce, Royal Australian Air Force. He was 21 years old in February 1942. Raised on a small farm in Queensland, Pearce had grown up repairing engines and machinery out of necessity. When he enlisted in the RAAF in 1940, he imagined himself in the cockpit of a fighter, high above the ground, doing the kind of work that appeared in recruitment posters. Instead, he was sent north and assigned to ground crew duties at RAAF Base Darwin. It was not the role he wanted, but it was one he took seriously. Pearce worked long hours maintaining the base's P-40 Kitty Hawks, checking fuel lines, adjusting control cables, and replacing damaged parts scavenged from other aircraft. He knew the planes intimately, not as symbols of air power, but as machines that either worked or failed, depending on attention to detail. The tropical climate was brutal on equipment. Corrosion was constant. Mistakes could kill pilots. By the morning of February 19th, Pearce was on early shift, already sweating in the heat, moving between revetments as the airfield slowly came to life. He had no idea that within minutes, every assumption he held about his place in the war would be tested. Flight Lieutenant Robert Bob Oestreicher, United States Army Air Forces. Oestreicher was 23. He was an American fighter pilot who had already seen the war at close range. Trained in the Philippines, he had experienced the opening Japanese attacks firsthand. Airfields destroyed on the ground, aircraft lost before they could fight back, retreats carried out under constant pressure. Those experiences shaped him. He did not underestimate Japanese pilots or their aircraft. Temporarily stationed in Darwin, Oestreicher flew a P-40 like the Australians he was supporting. He was confident, sometimes blunt, but disciplined in the air. On the morning of February 19th, he was already airborne on a routine patrol. It was not an alert scramble. It was habit, timing, and coincidence. That chance would place him in the only position from which immediate resistance was possible. Ordinary Seaman Edward Perryman, Royal Australian Navy. Perryman was 19 years old and far from home. He had grown up in Sydney and joined the Navy to escape routine and see something of the world. Instead, he found himself aboard HMAS Katoomba, a corvette assigned to escort and harbour duties in the north. Darwin was hot, isolated, and monotonous. Days blended together, broken only by maintenance, watches, and letters written and rewritten to family. On the morning of the attack, Perryman was below deck, seated in a cramped space, writing to his mother. The ship was alongside in the harbour, engines quiet, crews scattered across routine tasks. There was no sense of urgency, no expectation of danger. Like many in Darwin, he believed the fighting was still far away. A mechanic on the ground, a pilot in the air, and a sailor below deck. They did not know one another. They were not heroes by reputation or rank. They were young men performing ordinary duties in a place considered peripheral to the war. Within the next hour, each would be forced into decisions shaped not by planning or preparation, but by instinct, responsibility, and circumstance. Darwin would bring them together, not as names in a report, but as witnesses to the moment the war arrived without warning and without mercy. Darwin was exposed long before the first bomb fell. Despite its location on Australia's northern edge, the town had never been developed as a true frontline base. It was treated as a remote outpost, useful, but not essential. Supplies arrived irregularly. Defensive planning lagged behind events. The assumption was that any serious threat would be detected far to the north, giving ample warning. That assumption shaped everything that followed. The air defences were thin to the point of being symbolic. On the morning of February 19th, Darwin had just 14 operational fighters. Some were modern P-40 Kitty Hawks, others were Wirraways, aircraft designed primarily for training, not interception. Many pilots had little combat experience. Some had never fired their guns in anger. There was no standing plan for mass interception, no rehearsed response to a large-scale raid. Anti-aircraft protection was equally inadequate. Guns were scattered around the harbour and airfield without coordinated fire control. Crews lacked training. Ammunition supplies were limited. Several pieces were obsolete, leftovers from an earlier war, pressed into service because nothing better was available. Communication between batteries was poor, and many positions had no clear line of sight over the harbour. Radar coverage existed in name only. Darwin had a single operational radar set. It was basic, unreliable, and dependent on interpretation rather than automation. At 9:37 a.m., the operator detected a large formation approaching from the north. The report was passed up the chain. The response was dismissal. American bombers were expected in the area, and the formation's size seemed to match that expectation. No alarm was sounded. Civil defense systems were fragmented. Air raid sirens were not properly connected. There was no unified command structure linking the Royal Australian Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and civilian authorities. Each operated within its own limited sphere, assuming someone else would take responsibility if a crisis emerged. Meanwhile, the harbour itself was crowded and vulnerable. 45 ships lay at anchor or alongside, merchant vessels, fuel tankers, naval escorts, supply ships, and transports. They were packed closely together, many loaded with fuel or ammunition. Manoeuvring space was minimal. If an attack came, there would be nowhere to run. But no one truly believed an attack was coming. Darwin had not drilled for an air raid. Many personnel had never been to action stations. Cargo was still being unloaded. Crews worked in the open. Some weapons were unmanned. The town continued its routine, unaware that it was already inside the engagement envelope of a Japanese carrier force. When the truth became undeniable, it was too late. 242 Japanese aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and level bombers were already descending. They came from 4 aircraft carriers, veterans of earlier operations across the Pacific. Their approach was coordinated, timed, and deliberate. Against them stood 14 fighters, scattered gun crews, and thousands of men who had never faced combat. Darwin was not merely outmatched. It was caught unready, unprotected, and exposed at the exact moment when hesitation mattered most. At 9:58 a.m., the first wave struck. On the airfield, leading aircraftman Charles Pierce was beneath the wing of a Kitty Hawk when the detonations rolled across the ground. At first, they felt distant, like thunder. Then the concussions sharpened, closer, heavier. He looked up and saw aircraft everywhere, tight formations moving with precision he had never witnessed. Fighters swept ahead, bombers followed behind them in disciplined lines. There was no mistaking what this was. The harbour took the first blows. Bombs fell among the ships with deliberate spacing. HMAS Neptuna was hit early. Fire reached her cargo almost immediately, and the resulting explosion tore the centre out of the anchorage. The blast flattened men on deck, hurled debris across the waterfront, and sent fragments of steel spinning through the air. Pierce felt the shockwave half a mile away, as if the ground itself had lifted and dropped him. Below deck on HMAS Katoomba, ordinary seaman Edward Perryman was thrown violently against a bulkhead. The lights went out. Water surged in through ruptured fittings. Men shouted in the dark, struggling to find ladders and hatches. When Perryman reached the upper deck, the scene above bore no resemblance to the harbour he knew. Ships burned from bow to stern. Oil spread across the water in thick black sheets. Aircraft dived screaming out of the sun, releasing bombs at impossible angles. Nearby, the American destroyer USS Peary fought back. Her guns fired continuously, tracers climbing into the sky. She shot down several attackers, but she was isolated and exposed. Bombs fell around her, then struck home. Within minutes, she was mortally damaged, her decks torn open, fires raging. Orders to abandon ship came too late for many. Perryman watched men leap into burning water, some vanishing almost immediately beneath the surface. In the air, Flight Lieutenant Bob Oestreicher was already engaged. Flying a single P-40 with one wingman, he turned directly into the incoming Japanese formation. His first firing pass tore into a dive bomber, which broke apart and fell into the harbour. He pulled up hard, rolled, and went after another. The response was immediate. 0 fighters swarmed him, faster and more agile. His wingman was hit and exploded without warning, leaving Oestreicher alone. He kept fighting. Shrapnel cut through his canopy. His cockpit filled with smoke. He fired until the aircraft shuddered from recoil, then switched targets, striking another bomber as it pulled out of its dive. Ammunition ran low. Enemy aircraft filled every quadrant of sky. On the ground, Pierce and the surviving ground crew tried to get fighters airborne. They dragged Kitty Hawks from revetments by hand, shouting for pilots. Some aircraft were destroyed before engines could start. Others were strafed as they taxied. One inexperienced pilot managed to lift off, engage briefly, then vanished into the sea under a hail of fire. By 10:15, the harbour was an inferno. 8 ships were sinking or ablaze. Ammunition detonated aboard wrecks, firing blindly into smoke. Civilian buildings were hit without pause. The post office disappeared under rubble. The hospital was struck despite clear markings. Fires spread unchecked. At 10:25, the second wave arrived. Land-based bombers targeted the airfield with precision. Pierce threw himself into a trench as explosions marched across the runway. Hangars collapsed. Aircraft were shredded. The airbase ceased to function as a fighting unit. At 10:40, the aircraft turned north. The noise faded. The destruction remained. 43 minutes after it began, Darwin lay broken, and every survivor understood that nothing about the war would ever feel distant again. At 10:42 a.m., Darwin was no longer a battlefield. It was a disaster zone. Smoke covered the harbour in thick layers, drifting inland and blotting out the sun. Fires burned unchecked along the waterfront. There was no clear authority issuing orders, no organised response taking shape. Communications were down. Officers were dead or missing. Men acted on instinct, not instruction. On the wharf, ordinary seaman Edward Perryman stood shaking, soaked in oil and water. HMAS Katoomba was settling fast, her deck tilted sharply. From inside the hull came pounding, fists on steel, voices shouting for help. Men were trapped below, compartments already flooding. Perryman hesitated only once. Others were running inland, away from the ships, away from the risk of further explosions. The smell of burning fuel was overpowering. Ammunition continued to detonate aboard nearby wrecks. Every second increased the danger. He went back into the water. The oil burned his skin as he swam. He reached a hatch jammed by blast damage and forced it open with a piece of debris. 3 men crawled out, choking and disoriented. Perryman got them to a small boat, then turned back again. On his third return, explosions ripped through Katoomba's interior. The ship lurched lower. Inside, water was rising fast. He found 2 sailors, one badly injured, another blinded by burns. He dragged them through dark, flooded compartments, forcing them upward as the hull groaned around them. When he pushed them through the hatch, the deck was nearly awash. He escaped seconds before the ship slipped further under. At the airfield, leading aircraft man Charles Pierce faced a different crisis. The base was wrecked. Most aircraft were destroyed, but one Kitty Hawk remained intact, hidden in a revetment missed by the bombing. It was fueled, armed, ready. There were no pilots left able to fly. Pierce knew the controls. He had flown unofficially, quietly, never in combat. His commanding officer was dead. The radio was silent. There was no permission to ask for, and no time. He climbed into the cockpit. Dodging craters, he took off from the damaged runway and climbed over burning Darwin. Alone, he patrolled the northern approaches, scanning for returning aircraft. His hands shook. His mouth was dry. For nearly an hour, he flew without contact, but his presence mattered. One fighter in the air meant the defense was not finished. When he landed, he expected a rest. Instead, he was saluted. Across town, civilians fought their own battle. With officials gone and buildings destroyed, medical care collapsed into improvisation. A civilian doctor organized treatment in damaged facilities, operating without anesthetic, using whatever tools were available. Wounded men lay on floors and tables, waiting in silence or pain. Flight Lieutenant Bob Oostreicher, wounded and exhausted, flew again. His aircraft barely held together, but he took off to ensure no invasion force followed the raid. Only when fuel ran low did he return. He collapsed after landing, his part finished. These moments defined the attack. Not commands or plans, but individuals acting when systems failed. Darwin survived not because it was prepared, but because people refused to stop when stopping would have been easier. By midday, Darwin no longer resembled a functioning port or town. Smoke still rose from the harbour in heavy columns. Fires burned through fuel dumps and warehouses, some of them uncontrolled for days. The water was choked with wreckage, debris, and bodies. Rescue efforts continued in silence, broken only by shouted instructions and the crackle of collapsing structures. At least 243 people were killed during the attack. The true number was never known with certainty. Some bodies were destroyed by explosions. Others were lost at sea. It was the deadliest single attack ever carried out on Australian soil. 8 ships were sunk outright. 15 more were damaged. The American destroyer USS Peary lay on the bottom of the harbour with most of her crew still trapped inside. She became a war grave, untouched in the decades that followed. 20 aircraft were destroyed. The RAAF base was rendered inoperable. Darwin's fuel reserves were largely gone. Militarily, the damage was severe. Darwin could no longer function as a major supply or staging base. Japanese planners had achieved their immediate objective without landing a single soldier. Australia's northern lifeline had been cut. But Darwin did not collapse entirely. Survivors remained and worked. Sailors and civilians pulled the wounded from the water. Fires were fought where possible. Bodies were recovered and buried quickly in the heat. Improvised command structures emerged to replace those that had failed. Life did not return to normal, but it did not stop. The Australian government reacted cautiously. News of the attack was heavily censored. Casualty figures were minimised. Details were withheld. Leaders feared panic and believed the public was not ready to confront the reality that the mainland was vulnerable. For months, most Australians understood only that Darwin had been bombed, not how badly or how often, because the attacks did not stop. Darwin would be raided 64 times over the next 21 months, more frequently than Pearl Harbor. Each strike reinforced the message that Australia was no longer beyond reach. Hundreds of civilians fled south. The population dropped from around 2,000 to just a few hundred. Entire streets were abandoned. The town became a forward military zone, stripped of illusion. Yet the long-term effect was not surrender or withdrawal. It was resolve. The bombing of Darwin shattered complacency. Recruitment increased. Industrial output expanded. Defence planning changed fundamentally. Australia reoriented itself toward the Pacific War, accepting that its security depended on active resistance, not distance. For those who lived through February 19th, the memory never faded. The sound of aircraft overhead, the smell of fuel and smoke, the sudden understanding that no place was guaranteed safety. Darwin was Australia's awakening. It proved that war does not announce itself politely, and that courage is rarely found in grand strategy, but in individual decisions made under pressure. The town was bombed, it was damaged, it was scarred, but it did not surrender, and that is why it is remembered.